Well, welcome everybody to today's Authors at Google event. We are delighted to have Louisa Lim join us today. Louisa Lim is an NPR correspondent and the former BBC correspondent from Beijing. Louisa's written an amazing book. I've finished it over the past few days, and I strongly recommend reading it, as I'm sure you'll all want to do after you've talked or heard her talk. And it's called The People's Republic of Amnesia, Tiananmen Revisited. We're delighted to have her here today. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Christina, and thank you, Kirsty, for organizing this talk. I'm so happy to be here at Google. I've heard tell of the fabled Google headquarters, so it's a great privilege to be here. And I'm going to talk about my book, The People's Republic of Amnesia. And it's really about the legacy of Tiananmen and the events of 1989, how China, how those events changed China, and then how China went on to change those events as it rewrote its own history. It's about amnesia, which one very famous Chinese author, Yan Lianke, called a state-sponsored sport in China. And my book is about the people who refused to take part in that state-sponsored sport and what happened to them. And the story of how I wrote my book really started with this woman. She is a mother. Her name is Tang Deying. And I met her as I was working on a completely different assignment for NPR. I was a radio correspondent for NPR in China. And I was in Chengdu, more than 1,000 miles away from Beijing, when I met this woman. And she told me how she, all these years, for 2 decades, she'd been searching to find out what had happened to her son, who died in 1989 in Chengdu. And I was really surprised because I didn't know that anything had happened in Chengdu. And so I started asking her questions. And then the more that she told me, the more that I wanted to find out about this untold story. And so I started to look for eyewitnesses for the events that she was describing. And then I started to look for photographs, for video, for diaries, newspaper reports from Chinese newspapers at the time, diplomatic cables from the US records and other countries' diplomatic records. And by the end of this process, I'd pieced together this story that had never really been properly told before, of another crackdown, not just the killings in Beijing that we all know about, but killings that happened 1,000 miles away on the other side of the country. And it was a story that I did not know that I was going to tell until I started to talk to her. But it really made me wonder, the central question that I was addressing was, how is it that something that happened within living memory can be forgotten? Because after all, this was only 25 years ago, and there were so many people in Chengdu and elsewhere who saw those events. So how can that be forgotten? And the first thing that I realized was that memory really is surprisingly dependent on geography. So when we in the West think about Tiananmen Square, we often think about this picture. Raise your hands if you've seen this before. Okay, wait, raise your hand if you haven't seen this picture before. So 100% of people in this room know this picture, that moment when Tank Man, as he's come to be known as, stood in front of a line of tanks on the boulevard, the Avenue of Everlasting Peace that leads to Tiananmen Square. I think perhaps fewer people have seen the raw footage of that moment, which is also incredibly powerful. In fact, there was a British playwright, Lucy Kirkwood, who wrote a play about this moment. The play is called Chimerica. And she wrote, "This is a picture of the moment that China exchanged democracy for an economic miracle, for the opportunity to work, live, spend, progress." So that static shot is that moment that we associate in the West with June the 4th, and with the events that happened at Tiananmen Square. But actually, there's an awful lot that is also forgotten about that moment, even in the West. In fact, this didn't even happen on June the 4th. It happened on June the 5th, the day after the killings in Tiananmen Square. And the fact that he climbed up onto the tank and he exchanged words with the soldier inside the tank, it is also forgotten. And we don't know what he said, but the reports at the time say that he said, "Leave my people alone." We also do not know who this man is. We do not know what happened to him after this moment. At the very end of this footage, you can see 3 people on bicycles coming to kind of whisk him away. And it's not clear if they're supporters sheltering him or people coming to detain and arrest him. But that moment, that particular moment, is really what we in the West associate with Tiananmen Square. And I think there's a lot about what happened in '89 which is forgotten in the West, because this wasn't a moment that happened in a vacuum. It was the culmination of 7 weeks of a student and popular movement. And that movement began in the middle of April when the Communist Party leader, Hu Yaobang, who had been there, when he died suddenly of a heart attack, he had been the head of the Communist Party, but he'd been removed after student demonstrations a couple of years before. But the students liked him a great deal. He was seen as a liberal, as a reformer, and they felt a great deal of sympathy for him. So when he died, they all came out on the streets and they began mourning him. And very, very quickly, the mourning turned into protests, calling for freedom, for democracy, a free press, an end to corruption, and other demands like this. The protests spread around the country and they continued to build. And then towards the end of April, for the first time, the government came out and said its position, which was that these protests were turmoil and that they should end. For the students, they saw this editorial as a sign that the government would go after them no matter what they did. So they continued to protest, and by May the 4th, there were 1 million people on the streets protesting. In the middle of May, the students began a 6-day-long hunger strike. And as all of this was going on, there was also a power struggle at the highest levels of the Communist Party. This was the last appearance by Zhao Ziyang, who was the Communist Party leader at the time and who was the loser in that power struggle. He turned up at 5 o'clock in the morning on Tiananmen Square saying to the students, "We have come too late." And after that, he spent the next 15 years until his death under house arrest. So that was the moment at which the hardliners in government took control, and they declared martial law the next day. And they sent troops in to try and clear the square. This was the first attempt that troops had made. And this is also something that was forgotten, that first attempt was not actually successful. The troops came in, and as they were coming in, just crowds and crowds of people swarmed around the lorries. They lay down in front of the wheels, and they stayed there, sometimes for 3 days and 3 nights. And the troops were just effectively marooned in a sea of people, and they had to withdraw. And they went back to their barracks. And the students saw this as a great victory. But as we know now, it was only a temporary victory. And on the night of June the 3rd to June the 4th, the troops were sent in again, this time in great numbers, with the order to take the square at all costs. Even now, we don't know how many people died. The first numbers that the government put out said 241, but there were estimates that were much higher. The Red Cross at the time went round the hospitals and said 2,600 people. They'd counted 2,600 bodies, but those estimates were later withdrawn after complaints from the Chinese. So there's still a lot that is unknown in the West even about those events. But this is that image that remains. And I think in the West, it's really become part of our popular culture. It's become a meme, which is so used so much that it's really readily understood without any kind of explanation. So here are some examples that I found. There's Obama's first trip to China. He's seen as a squeegee guy begging the PLA for a handout. In the same year, Iran had protests where the students were using social media to protest against election results. And you can see the mullahs in the tank saying he's twittering, and he's there on his BlackBerry tweeting away. Then 2 years ago, when Edward Snowden fled to Russia, again, this same image occurred. And I think that it really has entered our popular culture. If there was any doubt about it, here it is on The Simpsons. And just one last example. It's hard to believe that anybody could have thought that this was a good idea, but here is a Tankman advert that was shot for the Peach Bowl in the US. Yep, that was a true, real ad for Chick-fil-A. So I think this really shows the kind of role that picture has played in our popular culture. And when I was starting to think about the legacy of Tiananmen in China, what I wanted to know was how familiar young Chinese people would be with this picture. After all, nowadays, the 650 million Chinese people online. And although the internet is very heavily censored, there's a lot that gets through. It's quite a leaky system. And a lot of young people know how to circumvent the censorship. So one of the experiments that I did was to take this picture, the picture of Tankman, around 4 Beijing universities. And they were the 4 universities that were most instrumental in 1989 in the protests. And I asked students, do you recognize this image? And if they said yes, I would kind of double check with them to see if they really did know what it was. And I remember in this room, 100% of people knew this image. I was really surprised to find only 15% of the students that I talked to could identify this image. And you may ask, well, how can you tell if people are lying? And that was something that I didn't know when I started, whether I would be able to tell. And it was really surprising to me that you could immediately tell because of the power of the image. Those students who knew what that image was, they had this sort of physical reaction. They would look at the picture and they would kind of shy away from it. Some of them gasped. One of them said, "Oh my God." And it was clear if they knew what it was. I mean, there was one young man who even said, "I do not know what this image is, but it's too controversial and I can't talk to you about it." So he knew. Whilst the 85 students I spoke to who couldn't identify the image, when they looked at it, when they looked at the Tankman picture, they would lean in and they would point to things and they would ask questions. So I was asked, is it South Korea? Is it Kosovo? One student pointed at the lamppost, which is really, really distinctive. They're only in Tiananmen Square. And said, well, it really looks like Tiananmen, but it can't be. So it was clear that this, although the censorship is leaky, that it is actually working when it comes to a large proportion of people in China and young people in China. Those students who did know what the picture was, often they would defend the behavior of the government, and they would say things like China's economic progress in the last 30 years was only possible because of the actions that the government took in Tiananmen Square. So it was really a retrospective justification for the killings based on the economic performance of the last 25 years. And that's really the government's line as well. And it's a line which a lot of Chinese people both believe in and agree with. So, and actually 19 of the students that I spoke to believed that it was a military parade, this picture, because they just couldn't conceive of any other reason why there would be tanks running down that road. So that was one of the things that I discovered. And the other thing that I discovered was how nervous it made me walking around university campuses with this tank man picture. And I was really surprised by that, because at that stage I'd been a journalist in China for more than 10 years. And, you know, let's be honest, I had a license. I had a literal license, a journalist card in my pocket, which allowed me to go and ask sensitive questions. And yet I was really nervous. I was convinced I was going to be detained. I was sort of sweating. My hands were clammy. And then I realized how much I myself had internalized the censorship. That just walking around with a photograph asking questions was making me really paranoid and scared. And I also realized if I, who had a license to be doing this, if I was so nervous, what was it like for ordinary Chinese people who I was talking to? So it really made me think. And I started to wonder, well, why don't young Chinese people know what's happened? And of course, the censorship is one of the reasons. If you search on Google for Tiananmen, you will get immediately pictures of Tank Man, you'll get the Wikipedia article about the protests, and a whole lot more. If you use the Chinese search engine Baidu, you get pictures of Tiananmen Gate, tourist information about it, nothing else. If you look in textbooks, there's nothing about the events of 1989, except in one, the only textbook that I could find any allusion to it was undergraduate history textbook, and it was 529 pages long, and it had 4 pages on the events of 1989. And even that very, very short account contained what one French professor, Michel Bonin, called a monumental historical untruth, basically a lie. But if you were a young Chinese person, it would be difficult to conceive of that your textbooks actually had lies in them. That's not something that you would expect. As I said, there are ways of circumventing this kind of censorship. And particularly on social media, we see a lot of that. So, for example, June the 4th was blocked. So netizens started talking about May the 35th. Then May the 35th, these words were blocked. So they started talking about April the 65th. And then that was blocked. And then every year you have this kind of escalating censorship where more and more words are blocked. So in the last few years, words that have been blocked on social media in China around the anniversary include today, tomorrow, nostalgia, when spring turns to summer, and even the word sensitive word was blocked. Then last year, they even started blocking numbers. So people who were trying to send money using mobile messaging apps, if the money, the amount that they were trying to send had a 64 or an 89 in it, that was blocked. So you can see the way in which censorship, it impedes not just discussion, but commerce and innovation and education and all kinds of other things. So the censorship is such that this picture, which was a picture of young Chinese students in 1989 with gunshot wounds being rushed to hospital, this actually appeared in 2009 in a state-run newspaper in Beijing, the Beijing News. And at the time, there was a lot of discussion. It was part of an article. It was a profile of the photographer, and there was a lot of discussion. Maybe the newspaper's trying to send a coded message, what's going on? Later on, it turned out that, in fact, what had happened was nobody who worked at the newspaper, not the page editor or the photo editor or the section editor, not even the censor, nobody actually recognized what this picture was and realized that it was sensitive enough to censor. So to me, that's actually a sign of both the success and the failure of Chinese censorship. It's been so successful that the institutional memory of June the 4th is beginning to fade, and people no longer realize that it needs to be censored. It's not just the Chinese press that has difficulty reporting on these things. I mean, they're basically banned. You almost never get reports in the Chinese press about June the 4th. But the Western press in China, too, does find itself having trouble reporting on these things. And I'm just going to show you my one last clip, which was from the year 2009, the 20th anniversary. And normally, if as a TV crew, when the anniversary comes round, you want to go down to Tiananmen Square and you want to shoot your piece to camera saying it's the anniversary and security's really tight, blah, blah, blah. And you have to apply for a permit, and you get given this permit which gives you, say, 20 minutes on the square, and you have handlers, government minders watching you always, and it's very tightly controlled, but you're allowed to do that. But in 2009, for some reason, the government decided to unroll its new strategy to deal with Western press reporting on the anniversary. I like to think of it, I like to call it the umbrella men of Tiananmen Square. So this is not the behavior of a government that is at peace with its own past. And actually, I should say, last year on the 25th anniversary, the government, the authorities decided to stop pussyfooting around, and they basically just visited journalists in their offices and said, you will not report on the anniversary, you will not go to Tiananmen Square. If you do, there will be consequences which we are not going to share with you at this moment. And those reporters who did go to Tiananmen Square found that they were often stopped and searched, they were pulled in for questioning, they were detained temporarily. So that it's interesting that over time, the reporting on the events that happened 25 years ago hasn't become any easier. In fact, it's become a great deal more difficult. And in my book, I profile a number of people whose lives were changed by the events of '89. The people, as I told you, who refused to forget. Among them is this woman who is the mother of a 19-year-old boy who died in 1989 taking photographs of the troops. And she was one of the mothers that started the Tiananmen Mothers, which is a support group, a lobbying group. It became the first political grassroots lobbying group in China. And last year, on the 25th anniversary, she was part of this commemoration symposium, which was held in Beijing in someone's apartment. 15 people took part in that. And this is their commemorative photo. And within days of that photo being taken, 5 of those people had been detained, and all the rest had been hauled in for questioning. And some of them ended up being charged with creating a public disturbance, even though this was a meeting in somebody's apartment behind closed doors. To this date, one of them, lawyer Pu Zhiqiang here, is still in custody facing charges of incitement to subversion. And another person who I profile in my book is this man. His name is Chen Guang, and in 1989 he was a 17-year-old soldier. He was one of the martial law troops that was sent to clear the square. Afterwards, he quit the army and he became an artist. He went to art school, and ever since then, almost all the art he's created has a link to 1989, to the events of Tiananmen. He cannot really show or sell his art in China. Last year, at the anniversary, he put on this art performance where he was in this deserted art studio, and he'd painted dates on the walls starting in 1989 and ending in 2014. And then he took white paint and he whitewashed the walls. He said, "History is like a blank. It has been wiped out." And for that act, he was detained by police and spent 6 weeks in police custody. Actually, last year, more than 150 people were arrested or detained or placed under house arrest in the clampdown, which was the worst in years. And they involved, included people like there was a Buddhist monk who was giving a lecture on Buddhism in a Shangri-La hotel. And he was also arrested for incitement to subversion. There was a factory worker, a young factory worker, who visited Tiananmen Square and took a selfie making the V sign like this. And he was also detained for creating a public disturbance, because back in 1989, the students went like this. So to me, this idea of history being wiped out, I could see it happening in front of me, but nowhere was this more true than in Chengdu, the city that you can see in the middle of the map there, more than 1,000 miles from Beijing, because this was a story that had never really been properly told before. But in Chengdu, there was also this, huge demonstrations in the streets in April and May. Students from many local universities, these workers from the meteorological university, so government work units came to protest, and protesting was so normal that instead of asking each other, "Have you eaten yet?" people used to greet each other by saying, "Have you protested yet?" The students and the protesters also in Chengdu occupied this square right in the middle of town, beneath the feet of this massive Chairman Mao statue, and they launched their own hunger strike and settled in. On June the 4th in Chengdu, the square was cleared, but it was cleared quite peacefully. And that's when things started to go differently than they had in Beijing. Because the square in Chengdu was cleared peacefully, but after it was cleared, people in Chengdu began to hear what had happened in Beijing. And they came out on the streets again to protest, this time against the brutality in Beijing. And this was taken on the morning of June the 4th in Chengdu. And you can see the signs that they're carrying read, June the 4th massacre, 7,000 dead and injured. This one says, "We are not afraid to die." In Chengdu, the authorities, of course, moved in again, this time with water cannon and tear gas. And the people started throwing rocks and stones, bricks, anything, bottles, anything they could find at the authorities. This was the paramilitary armed police. And there were basically 3 days of running battles in Chengdu. You can see here from this shot, which I blew up, you can see at the front how the authorities dealt with protesters in Chengdu. They didn't open fire at them. They instead used batons, and they beat the protesters, and they targeted them round the heads. And these were pictures sent to me by eyewitnesses who were there at the time, who were inside the hospitals taking pictures of what they had seen. You can see from the preponderance of head injuries the way the authorities dealt with it. And these protests and the crackdown was so big that the government could not cover it up in Chengdu. They had to admit to what had happened. So they actually put out their own version of events. This was a propaganda book that was put out within a month. 760,000 copies were printed. And in this book, they admitted that people had been killed during that crackdown. They said that 8 people died, 2 of them students, 1,800 people were injured. They said mostly policemen. But then, as I started to look into this more, I was really shocked to discover that, in fact, that wasn't the worst thing that happened in Chengdu at the time. After that incident, the people of Chengdu they were so angry that they retaliated against the government by burning down or vandalizing government properties. And that includes police cars, fire engines, government offices, and this was a government-run market which took up an entire city block, and it was burnt down as an act of protest. I used US diplomatic cables as one of the sources because the US had a consulate general in Chengdu at the time, and it was actually at the center of what I'm about to tell you about, the next incident that I'm about to tell you about, which happened in this hotel, the Jinjiang Hotel, which was the smartest hotel in Chengdu at the time, and it still exists, and it's quite swanky nowadays. But the US consul general had his office there, and he also lived in that building. And at that time, a lot of the foreigners in Chengdu had been evacuated and were staying in this building. So they were witnesses to the incidents that I'm going to describe to you. So it was on the night of June the 5th to June the 6th. There were huge demonstrations in the square, and the police were trying to clear them. And then there was this incident where the shop which sold sort of foreign alcohol and cigarettes on the ground floor of this hotel was ransacked. And then the police came in to restore order. And they marched all the protesters out and had them kneeling in rows in the courtyard of that hotel. So all the foreigners who had rooms in the front of that hotel were witness to what happened next. They saw dozens and dozens of people detained, kneeling in the courtyard, their hands wired behind their backs. 2 witnesses said their hands were wired in such a way that their arms would need to be broken. Then they watched as plainclothes policemen walked along between the rows of people, and they watched as an order was given, and the plainclothes policemen took these iron rods and batons and smashed the protesters one by one, smashed their heads in. 2 trucks pulled in, and the bodies were thrown into the trucks like garbage, like sacks of potatoes, like slabs of meat, like carcasses. Those are different descriptions from 4 different witnesses. And I was amazed that most of them did not know that anybody else had seen the same sights that they had seen. One of them said, "I don't remember anyone screaming. There was no noise, just the bodies piling up on top of each other. There were definitely lifeless bodies. I imagined if anyone was alive, they would not survive in that pile." So I needed to know what had happened in that hotel on that day. So I went back to the Chinese sources to see if there was any mention of this. And I was surprised to find that there was a great deal written about this incident. And the Chinese sources said 70 people, 70, were detained in that hotel at that day. And the Chinese newspapers even talked about the police's use of violence against protesters. So the big question was, were all of those people killed in plain view of all the watching foreigners? And the honest truth is, I don't know for sure. I can't give you an answer. Too many years have passed, and we just don't know for sure. What I do know is those eyewitnesses believed they witnessed an atrocity. Many of them, after leaving China, they were evacuated out and they went to Amnesty International, they went to rights groups, they went to the newspapers, they went to the media, and they tried to tell what they had seen. But what had happened in Beijing was so much bigger and so much more dramatic, and there were no pictures to this, so nobody listened to them. I did find pictures in the Chinese propaganda which very closely tracked the kinds of stories that I was being told, though, of people being beaten over the head, of people being loaded into trucks, of people being rounded up, having their hands tied together, being thrown face down on the floor, and this kind of thing. But then I went back to Tang Diying, the woman who I told you about at the beginning. And I always had her story at the back of my mind because she had been trying for all these years to find out what had happened to her son. And she discovered that he'd been riding his bicycle home, he'd been detained by police. She'd been told by someone he was detained with that he was beaten to death by police. And so for 25 years, she tried to get an answer as to exactly what had happened. She went to Beijing 5 times. Each time she was caught and sent back. She was locked in an iron cage twice. For 2 years, 2 full years, she had a police car stationed in front of her house. But she went on. And after 11 years, her persistence had a very surprising result. She was given by the local police chief a photograph of her son's corpse. And you could see very clearly from this single photograph that he had been beaten. His face was swollen, his nose was swollen, there were bruises. It was quite clear that violence had been used against him. In 2006, she was given a payment of almost $9,000. It's the first payment that's ever been made in connection with a 1989 death, although it was called a hardship allowance rather than any kind of compensation. And so I thought if anybody was going to know about what happened back then, it would be her. So I went to her and I asked her, well, were there others like you? Are there others like you out there who lost their children in Chengdu in 1989 and who just don't know what happened to them? And she looked me in the eye and she said, even if I knew, I wouldn't tell you. And that was when I realized if this woman who had been through so much, who had risked so much, if even she could not talk openly about what had happened in 1989, then who would? That was also when I realized another thing, that forgetting is not something that's imposed from above. It's something that people have been co-opted into. They've cooperated with this because it's not convenient to remember what happened in 1989. There's no benefit at all. In fact, there's a very, very major cost to any kind of active acts of memory. So people simply do not want to remember. It's easier to turn away, to forget, to never talk about it, to pretend nothing happened. And I'm just going to tell you one last story. This is about an artist whose name is Sheng Qi. And he was not in Tiananmen Square in 1989. He had gone back to his hometown, but he was very sympathetic to the students. And when he heard what happened in 1989, he said it was as if he had gone mad. This kind of madness seized him. And he, as an act of protest, he took a meat cleaver and he hacked off his own little finger. And he used that in his art for years. This is artwork called Myself. And he's holding a picture of himself as a young boy. But now 25 years has passed, and he has a young son, 13-year-old son. And so we were just chatting, and I just asked him, well, what do you tell your child about what happened to your finger? And he kind of looked a little embarrassed. And then he said, well, you know, normally I tell him that I left it on the bus. And I suppose he's, you know, surely, of course he doesn't believe that. And he said, well, I know he doesn't believe it, but I'm always thinking of some kind of story because he's still a little kid and I want to protect him. And that's how people feel. They feel that their children need protecting from the truth in order to survive and to thrive. And there are people who say, well, does it really matter anymore what happened in Beijing or Chengdu or anywhere else in 1989? Because, you know, China's now the world's second largest economy. It's pulled hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. Does it really make any difference? And my answer would be, yes, it does matter. It matters because history matters. And history matters so much to the Chinese government that they're willing to spend all this money, all this manpower, muzzling people like these mothers who simply want to find out what happened to their children. So I would say that the cover-up, it's not just at the top. After all, memory is that most personal of spaces. It's inside your own head. But people have allowed themselves to be co-opted. They've colluded with this idea that memory is political. And they've allowed themselves to be party to state-sponsored amnesia. I'm going to end by paraphrasing the words of one dissident who said, a massive secret has become like a massive vacuum. The crimes of state are slowly being replaced by the crime of silence. And that is a crime in which almost everyone is complicit. Thank you.
We've got a few minutes for questions, so we can probably get one or two in if anyone would like to ask the questions. Louisa, if I can just ask you to repeat the question once it's asked.
Sure.
Thank you.
So, any questions? Yes?
Did you experience any difficulties or any interference when you were doing your research and your investigation for the book?
Well, I was working as a journalist for NPR at the time, so I went to quite extraordinary and probably unnecessary lengths to try to cover up what I was doing. I mean, I was working as a journalist, but I was on the side writing this book. So I did take a lot of precautions. I never talked about the book at home or in the office because I lived and worked in a diplomatic compound which was widely believed to be bugged. I never emailed about it. I never talked on the telephone. So if I wanted to interview someone, I would never say, oh, I'm writing a book about this. I would just say, I'm a foreign journalist. Can I come and see you? And then I got increasingly more paranoid as time passed. So I would write. I had a computer that had never been online, and at night I would lock it in a safe in my bedroom and wonder if I was going a little too paranoid. So, I mean, I experienced interference, but only the kind of interference that journalists experience as part of their work in China, which, yeah, it can be. I mean, it can be quite tough to do your job, but it's normal. You get used to it after a while. And because I think my press handlers, they didn't really know what I was doing. After the book came out, I mean, I never had any comeback, but I do know that The Economist magazine wrote a very nice review that was this double-page review. And when that issue of The Economist arrived in China, every page that mentioned my book had been ripped out one by one. So it's old-school censorship. They noticed. Yes.
So, when you try to forget or they try to cancel about, what were the consequences of Tiananmen? What has changed? Has there been any change in? Have they had an impact or no impact?
Yeah, I mean, Tiananmen is a huge turning point for China. It had a massive impact in every way, kind of politically, economically, socially. Because after Tiananmen, the government policies changed. There was no more political liberalization, and there hasn't been since then. whilst there was this decision to liberalize, to do economic reform and not political reform. So, politically it was a turning point, but there were all kinds of other ramifications as well.
Basically, they tightened their control.
Yeah, I mean, before Tiananmen, there had been moves towards political change, and afterwards, there has been no more moves to political change since. So yeah, control was tightened, but there were also other ramifications as well. So after Tiananmen, the leadership, Deng Xiaoping, decided that it had happened because young people didn't understand what China had been like pre-communist. So he brought in this huge program of patriotic education. And this is what, we're seeing the results of this even today in this young generation of more nationalistic Chinese, because at school now they're subject to this quite intensive program of patriotic education. And that is also a direct response to Tiananmen. I mean, another thing that changed was the security situation. The leadership decided that something like Tiananmen should never happen again. It could never happen again. So they really beefed up the internal security forces. So now China spends more on its internal security than it does on its army, on its national defense. And that is also a direct response to Tiananmen, because in '89 they saw how students around the country mobilized, how they all rose up together, and they decided that protest, must be localized and must be squashed before protesters join up in the same way again. So it was a massive turning point for China in every way. Yes.
So you mentioned a lot about how, I guess, the people in China at the time kind of are moving towards like amnesia or silence. But what about the diaspora? Like, do you find that like people who leave China are more open to talking about it or learning about it or kind of understanding it, or do they also still kind of have that fear from when they were in China about talking about it, or I don't know, that kind of thing?
It's a mix. It's a mix. I mean, increasingly we're seeing large numbers of Chinese students studying overseas. I mean, in the US, Chinese students are now the biggest overseas student body. So we are seeing more and more young Chinese overseas. And I've given a lot of talks at universities in the US, and I found that you do get young Chinese that come along and they're really fascinated. They never heard any of this before, and it's really shocking. And also quite paralyzing, because, I'm often asked, well, what am I supposed to do about this? What can I as a single individual do? So there is that response on the one hand, but on the other hand, a lot of the students that leave are the elite. They're the students who've been through this patriotic education, who've tested well at school, and in order to get into university, you take these exams, and the exams have quite there's a significant political component which involves having the right, knowing the right stances on history. So these tend to be, the elite, the well-educated, those that espouse the government position. So you do get students that leave China, that go overseas, and when they hear these other views of Chinese history, they become very defensive, and they argue and they say, this is all a Western conspiracy. Why should we believe you? This is not what our history books say. And in the US, certainly, there have been a number of scandals that I write about in my book where Chinese students have really pushed back extremely strongly, leading to fears actually about academic freedom in the US. So I think, there's a mixed reaction. And it's still hard to tell, but I think actually this is one of the repercussions of the post-Tiananmen patriotic education, that young Chinese are quite proud of their country and often do not want to hear critical views of it. Yes.
So having uncovered kind of the atrocities that happened in Chengdu, do you think it's likely that those happened all around China?
No. I think there was violence that happened in other cities, in Xi'an and a couple of other cities, but it was much smaller scale. It was, there were deaths that happened in other cities, but it was much earlier on. It was in mid-April, and I believe it was smaller scale. It's possible that things happened elsewhere that we don't know about, but I don't believe that it was widespread. I certainly don't believe that it happened in, dozens of places.
We have time for one more question.
A little bit more future-looking. Mystic Sea and all the elites are now at this beach resort, like working on the 13th five-year plan, etc., etc. The Economist believes that innovation is high on the agenda. Do you feel there is at some point going to be ultimately that would need to lead to less government? Do you think there is like an overlap between the economic reforms towards the political reforms? And do you see in the future some sort of light in political reforms? Will that happen? Maybe through that one.
Sorry, I completely forgot to repeat the questions. He asked what I see in China's future. I would say that we overseas, I think we've failed quite badly in predicting what will happen in China. If you look at Xi Jinping, the current president, there's not a single person, no China watchers, no academics, no policymakers, nobody predicted that he would come in and take this kind of nationalistic hardline and launch a massive clampdown. In fact, everybody was talking about, oh, maybe he's a closet reformer. And that turned out to be quite wrong. So I think often in the West, we're quite guilty of wishful thinking when it comes to looking at China predictions. But also, I think that we know less about China than we think we do. So I'm quite reluctant to make predictions, but I do not see any kind of signs of any political liberalization coming anytime soon. If you look at what's happening on the ground, it's the opposite. This clampdown that we saw that started, it got bad just around the time of the anniversary last year. And everybody said, oh, after Tiananmen, it will, things will get better. After the anniversary, things will get better. But they didn't get better. They got worse. And since then, we've seen a raft of legislation introduced on national security, against terrorism, cracking down on non-governmental organizations. And those would make it very difficult for NGOs, for civil society to develop. Then recently, there was a very intense crackdown on human rights lawyers, rights defenders, and more than 200 rights defenders were rounded up in just a very short period of time. So most of them have been released, but quite a lot of prominent ones are still completely missing. So I don't see any positive signs when it comes to political reform. On the economic front as well, I think we're entering this period of extreme uncertainty where the controls are being lifted slightly on the renminbi, but this has only just happened within the last few days, so it's difficult to tell how far that's going to happen and whether this is actually a move towards liberalization and why this is happening. I think that the next few months will be absolutely key to the rest of this term. But so far as well, if you look at the moves that have been taken in the South China Sea, they've been, the Chinese have been very aggressively expanding their territory, building islands, this kind of thing. And it doesn't look as if any kind of reform will be taken in the way that we in the West view as reform. The stance that seems to be happening is much more kind of hardline nationalist stance. But, you never know. You never know. We've been wrong in the past about China.
Excellent. Please join me in thanking Louisa for her excellent talk.